All right, so welcome back. We're going to talk about ion regulation today. And I think this might be one video, and then we may have one last shorter video simply on regulating pH. All right, so the ions we're going to concentrate on are sodium chloride, potassium, bicarbonate, and calcium. Now we've talked a bit about all of these except for chloride, but hopefully you'll see in a little bit why that's so important. All right, let's start with sodium. This is the most abundant extracellular ion, meaning this is the most abundant ion outside of cells. Now, in our average American diets, we take in a lot more sodium than our actual daily requirement is. So watch your sodium intake. Again, hormones will regulate our levels of sodium. So aldosterone will cause an increase in sodium reabsorption. If your sodium levels are too low, antidiuretic hormone actually will cease to be released. So let's kind of think about that. If your blood sodium levels are too low, it's probably because you have too much fluid in you, or if it's too dilute, you'll have a hard time with proper nerve and muscle contractions. So basically you're going to inhibit the release of antidiuretic hormone so you can produce lots of dilute urine until your sodium levels, the sodium concentration comes back up. And then atrial natriuretic peptide is going to increase sodium and water excretion if your sodium levels are too high. Now, one of the things in this sort of second one, kind of going back to this one, that's really important for you to understand, it is possible to have blood volume or your blood being too dilute. This was a case of Hold Your Wii for a Wii. Remember like the Wii gaming console, like released, I don't know, 10 years ago or so? Well, there was a sort of a contest on radio. I think it was a radio station out in California. And it was basically they gave the contestants, I forget exactly how much water, but like a little bottle of water every 10, 15 minutes to drink, and whoever, held their pee the longest, they held their wee, they got the gaming console. And doctors and nurses were calling into the radio station saying you're going to kill people, giving them that much water at one, in such a short period of time, not letting them go to the bathroom. And that's because, like, if we have too little sodium in our blood, right? Think about that. That's a hypotonic situation, right? In which if your cells are being bathed by hypotonic blood, water is going to go from where there's a lot, meaning in the blood, and it's going to try to go into the cells where it's more concentrated, right? Where solutes are more concentrated, causing them to swell. So what ends up happening is that neurons in particular are going to be very susceptible to this kind of swelling. So your brain swells, neurons get crushed, and essentially you die. And in fact, that's exactly what happened to this lady who won. She won when she was leaving the studio. By then she was already complaining of a severe headache. By the time she got home, the story goes that someone had called her mom saying, you need to go check on your daughter. By the time mom got home, her daughter was already dead. So again, really important to make sure that we don't just concentrate our urine, but we can also be able to produce lots of dilute urine to get rid of any excess water. I don't know if you guys have also heard of water intoxication. It's sort of the same idea, like before you get to that sort of deathly ill level, drink enough water, you will go through a stage where it feels like you're drunk. It affects, again, the brain, the neurons in the brain are swelling so much that they're not firing properly. So it kind of feels when you act like you're drunk, slurred speech, like messed up balance, that kind of thing, fuzzy decision making. In fact, in some rehab centers, they have to keep water under lock and key because people who are alcoholics and other drug addicts, they will try to drink so much water that they become, get that kind of buzz feeling, like that drunk kind of feeling. Okay. So hypernatremia is when you would have too much sodium. So you can see the levels here. And this is an issue because sodium retention causes water retention, and so you get that edema. We had talked about that back at the beginning of 202. Things that can cause sodium retention is something like kidney failure and too much aldosterone secretion. Okay. And then too little sodium. We've already kind of talked about this, so this would be that case that, holding your wee for a wee. It can cause some serious problems. You can have different causes to it. You can have what's known as euvolemic hyponatremia. So basically, this is the total amount of water in your body is going to increase, like you just drank a ton of water, kind of like that gaming situation, but your sodium content stays the same. There's hypervolemic hyponatremia. So basically, both sodium and water is going to increase, but the water gain is greater, right? And then hypovolemic hyponatremia. So water and sodium loss are water and sodium are both lost in the body, but sodium loss is greater. So sometimes this will happen if you're outside on a hot day. Sometimes because you lose salt in sweat. Sometimes people will lose a lot of salt in their sweat, and and sometimes that can cause this hypovolemic situation. And if all you're doing is replacing the water that you lost with just more water, it can cause sort of this some more of a combination of this euvolemic and hypovolemic kind of situation where you're losing both, but you're losing a lot more sodium, and then you're replacing it with simple water, diluting your salt even more. So it can sometimes be a bad spiral into a bad situation. That's why, for example, like marathon runners and stuff, even like athletes and stuff, they'll give them Gatorade instead of just plain water. All right. Chloride is also a major extracellular anion, so one that has a negative charge. And as we saw with the chloride shift, its main job is to help balance the charge of anions in the different areas of the body. Okay, there's lots of chloride leakage channels, so pretty much it simply follows sodium around. Like wherever sodium is getting transported, chloride kind of moves through leakage channels on its own. Obviously, there's some exceptions to this, like you saw in 201, like in the cell membrane of axons. So one of the unfortunate things is, and I guess maybe, well, I guess unfortunate is the word, but so maybe unexpected things, is that by lacking the proper channels to allow chloride in and out of cells, basically you end up forming, so here, let me kind of go to this bullet point. So basically, if you do not have the proper channels to move chloride in and out of cells, what ends up happening is that you end up forming very thick mucus. So you can see this, the transport of chloride ions help control the movement in tissues, which is necessary for the production of thin, freely flowing mucus. So what ends up happening is you have lots of thick mucus that affects all sorts of areas in the body, because as we've been talking, it's not just in your sinuses, really you're producing it, throughout your body. So it can cause things like sinus infections, lung problems, the sweat changes, it can block ducts in your liver, block ducts in the pancreas. It can cause, remember we're talking about how it's really important that the intestines do not have a very thick mucous membrane so they can absorb nutrients, so they have a hard time doing that. And then the reproductive organs also have mucousy secretions, and if that thickens, you're going to be fairly sterile. You won't be able to reproduce. All because of basically chloride channels not working. Kind of amazing, right? All right. So what about potassium? So we see lots of potassium inside cells, right? And as we've seen in 201, it helps maintain the proper conduction impulses in the firing of neurons, muscle contractions, and it'll also help with fluid volume. Okay, it'll be exchanged for hydrogen ions to help regulate the pH inside of cells. And the plasma levels of potassium is under the control of aldosterone, and aldosterone is a class of hormones called mineralocorticoids. Basically, if you're pumping sodium out of the body, you're going to be reabsorbing potassium. That's how aldosterone actually works. It pumps sodium out via the sodium potassium pump. So again, remember, if you're pumping 3 sodium out, you're getting 2 potassium in. Okay, oops. And it also helps establish the resting membrane potential in nerve and muscle cells. Okay. You can have hyperkalemia, so that is having too much potassium. And it can be very dangerous to have very high levels of potassium. You don't have to memorize these numbers. I'm just giving you ideas of what these numbers are. I'm getting them from the Mayo Clinic's website. It can be very dangerous if your potassium levels are too high. It can interfere with heart muscle contractions and obviously and even nerve signaling impulses. So obviously that's very dangerous. Okay. Most common cause of true high potassium or hyperkalemia is related to your kidneys. So in either acute or chronic kidney failures. However, you can have it because of Addison's disease, where the adrenal gland is not producing aldosterone properly. Alcoholism, or any kind of something that causes the breakdown of muscle fibers that causes the release of potassium into the bloodstream. Sometimes those angiotensin converting enzymes, those inhibitors, will cause high levels of potassium. Again, angiotensin 2 blockers can also cause that. Destruction of red blood cells, or just sometimes people just take way too many supplements. Bicarbonate, we've talked a bit about this. Excuse me. It is a significant plasma ion in electrolyte balance. We've seen like the chloride shift, for example. So we've seen it help buffer acids in the blood, right? It'll combine with hydrogen ions to eventually form carbon dioxide and water. Kidneys are the main regulators of plasma levels. So those intercalated cells will form more bicarbonate if your blood levels are too low, and any excess is simply released in urine. Okay. Calcium, right, obviously an important component of bones and teeth. It has a role in blood clotting cascade, if you remember neurotransmitter release, if you remember that back in 201. It's what helps stimulate the release of vesicles. Muscle tone and nerve and muscle function as well. Again, remember, sarcoplasmic reticulum held all the calcium. It bound to troponin, which pulled on tropomyosin, exposing those actin binding sites. It's regulated by a parathyroid hormone, which is going to stimulate osteoclasts. And if you remember, osteoclasts are the cells that break down bone. And by breaking down bone, you're simply releasing calcium into the bloodstream. It also is going to, parathyroid hormone also increases the production of calcitriol. And calcitriol is going to increase your calcium absorption from your gastrointestinal tract, as well as a reabsorption from what has been filtered through the glomerulus. All right, you can have something called hypocalcemia. Symptoms are numbness, muscle spasms, seizures, confusion, cardiac arrest. Things like this, what can cause it? Low vitamin D levels, so things that you're not absorbing it in your digestive tract, malnutrition. Again, you have problems with some sort of problems with absorbing calcium. You're not releasing enough of that parathyroid hormone, or once again, kind of like a kidney failure situation. And so what can also happen when you're looking at EKGs is with hypocalcemia, this ST segment can be prolonged. It actually looks stretched out. It's much longer than it should be. So this whole QT interval is much longer than it should be, and that's an indicator of hypocalcemia on an EKG. Okay, what about hypercalcemia then? So basically some of the symptoms, if you have too much calcium in your blood, your kidneys have to work harder. You can see it can cause excessive thirst, frequent urination. It can cause excess upset stomach, nausea, vomiting, constipation. Sometimes that happens when people take too many supplements. Bones and muscles. If you have excess calcium, sometimes it's leached from your bones, so that's not good. That can cause bone pain. It can also cause muscle weakness. And it can also interfere with the way your brain works, resulting in confusion, lethargy, and fatigue. So, right, there's things, these things, you know, with your body, you always want to maintain homeostasis. There is such a thing as too much of a good thing. So things that can cause it, overactive parathyroid glands, obviously cancers. There's many different diseases that can cause hypercalcemia. Sometimes immobility, simply being very sedentary. medication, supplements, and hereditary factors that may affect different parts of the body, like even like the kidneys not being able to filter calcium properly, or simply dehydration. All right, I'm going to stop there. Please let me know if you happen to have any questions, and I will see you on pH.